Incident detection and investigation in IBM QRadar is very important part for the SOC and SOC analyst. So it is better to understand how it works. Welcome to the Cybersecurity Awareness. My name is Rami. I'm a cybersecurity manager, and today I'm going to be to talk about the incident detection and investigation with QRadar. If you understanding the basic function, you will be easily know how it works. Understanding the architecture of QRadar is extremely important for any person working in a SOC, including analysts. From the instant investigation perspective, you need to understanding where the data is coming from and how it's being collected so you can have better understanding how the instance is being generated and how to collect more information if needed. Some environment, as we know, they have QRadar vulnerability management scanner. It's responsible for scanning vulnerability in a new environment and uploaded them to the console. Any environment can have multiple event collectors or multiple processor. For example, you can have one event collector in your data center in your organization and one main event processor. For now, let's take a look for each of those components. Event collector. Let's start by the event collector. As the name is suggests, the collector is collect events from the log sources. That can be done through syslog, wick, collect, or even reading log file from this area. After collecting logs from sources, the event collector normalizes the logs and putting the predefined fields for these logs, such as timetable, source IP, destination IP, host name, then and etc. Then QRadar maps the logs with the QID, which is QRadar identifier. Each log type has QID. A failed identification has QID and successful identification is another QID, and so on. Some cases QRadar bundle similar event. That's also called event coalescing, if applicable. For example, you have highly number of identical events in a very shortly time. So QRadar bundle them in one events and mark them as a coastal. Coastal once coastal out that done, QRadar forward to event processor, then how is configured to the collector sends the data to encrypted channel tree processor. Now let's talk a look about the event processor. First of all, you will receive the event processor will receive, normalize, and draw logs from collector. Then it stores event locally if the data is not present. If you have a data associated with the processor, the log will be stored in the data node. The third step is correlating the event with other event or other security information. The processor identifier behavior changes and policy violation for event. The processor distribute information for all of components depending on type of the event. And out that done, it shares the processor data with the magistrate component. Now let's take a look on the flow part of the diagram. It's very similar when you see as the last slide. The flow collector is collect flow from different flow sources such as network taps, span ports, net flow, S flow, Q flow, and etc. After collect the flows, the collecting normalize it, and this is similar to what event collector does. Flow collector extracts the main information from the raw logs and put it in normalized way. That done, the collector forwards the data to flow processor. The flow processor does the base the same thing. Then the event processor such as receive, normalize, and raw flows from collector, store events if data node not present, correlate with other flow events, identify behavior change and policy violation for the flow, distribute the information if applicable, send flow to the magistrate component console. Both event processor and the flow processor can be integrated with the data node, which basically adds storage and processing capacity to events. Once the event flow processor and it's mainly increase the search speed and store a large amount of data. The console is providing. Now let's take a look on the console. The console is providing the user web interface. Most likely you as an analyst whenever connect directly to event processor or event collector. Everything will be done through the console. It's truly transfer for the user how many devices in the environment since you have either you have one console manager, other devices and transparent wait for you. The console interface provides the analyst and new real-time events, flows, offenses, and much more. And as mentioned before, the console usually contains a magistrate component, which is service responsible for core processing component, such as reports, alerts, analysis, and processing custom rules. The last component I want to talk about is the vulnerability scanner. QRadar has its own vulnerability management solution, which is similar to Nessus, Qualys, and any other vulnerability management solution you may be familiar with. The component is responsible for actively scan servers for vulnerability. Vulnerability scanner provide vulnerability information for correlation as any management vulnerability solution. This can have a several configuration parameters without affecting the other service performance. Now let's see together how the information flow with the components. Let's start by the event. The log sources generate the logs which share the log collectors by the event collectors. Then the event collector normalize then the QID to event processor. The event processor receives the normalized logs. Processor apply behavior rules and store them, which in this case are be installed in the data node. Now let's take a look on the control. So let's take a look on the control part. As see the flow collector is listening to the network traffic on the particular network. Every second there is hundreds of flow are generated, which is collected by flow collectors. And the flow collectors normalize the logs and send them to the flow processor. The flow processor stores the flow locally and send it to the console. Now we know how the information flows. Let's see user does it query on console, requesting out the logs and the flow from specific IP from the last of 2 weeks. Now the console require event processor and the flow processor for your information. Then both processor preparing information and send it back to the console, which you prepare the data to present it to the user to the web interface. And now let's take a look for the distributed architecture example. As you can see, we have multiple event collectors and multiple event processor, and all of them are connected to the console. As I mentioned before, you can have multiple processor or collectors in one deployment. And if you are in a small organization or company, you can choose the centralized architecture example. You may have all components in one single box. This architecture is called all-in-one, which has all the components in one single box. Basically, This box doing the collection, processing, and user interface. The interesting thing, it doesn't matter how your architecture, if it is distributed or all in one scenario. The user interface will be exactly the same. If you have one collector prepared data centers, you will be able to locate the location of the servers just by looking which collectors are coming from.